The Book of Revelation is a very complicated book with many strange symbols and difficult things to understand. So in order to understand the Book of Revelation, what you need is a traveler's guide. And that traveler's guide is known as the Old Testament. Why does John tell the church of Smyrna that they will be tested for 10 days? Because 10 days is the number of days that Daniel and his companions were tested while in Babylon. John references the Old Testament hundreds of times in the Book of Revelation, all throughout the book. In fact, 1 out of every 2 verses is a direct allusion to the Old Testament. So if you want to understand the Book of Revelation, dig into your Old Testament scriptures because it will help you. Now, sometimes the references to the Old Testament are subtle. Sometimes they're difficult to understand. Sometimes he mixes multiple things from different passages of the Old Testament and he sort of puts it together. People have described John as sort of like a kid in a candy shop who he wants a little bit of this passage and a little bit of that passage and he throws them together and he mixes his metaphors and he doesn't wish to be consistent at all the way he uses things. Now, it would be nice if John just quoted one Old Testament passage, explained what he thought it meant, then quoted another Old Testament passage, explained what he thinks that means, and then move on and so on. But that's not the way the Book of Revelation is written. John just expects you to follow along, and he's not willing to slow down if you can't keep up. One example would be his introduction of Jesus. The golden sash and white robe come from Daniel's vision of the Son of Man of Daniel 10. The white hair is actually found in Daniel's vision of God the Father in Daniel 7. The feet like burnished bronze and voice like many waters comes from Ezekiel 1, Ezekiel 10, and Daniel 10. Face like the sun is also a combination of Ezekiel and Daniel, and the eyes like a flame of fire again comes from Daniel 7. This goes to show how John will use 2 or 3 or even more passages and all combine them into one picture to communicate what he's saying. Another example of this is Revelation 21 that describes the city of New Jerusalem as a cube with 3 gates on each side. Now, we read this and a lot of times people think that this is literal, but that's almost certainly not the case. The reason why there's a cube is based on the Old Testament. Can you think of anything in the Old Testament that was a cube? The Holy of Holies in the temple, the holiest place where God himself dwelled, was a cube, a perfect cube. And John is tying the Holy of Holies to Ezekiel's vision of the New Jerusalem in the later chapters of Ezekiel, and he's sort of mixing both of these Old Testament passages together to say that the New Jerusalem in which believers dwell will be itself the Holy of Holies, where God dwells in the midst of his people. He's using 2 different Old Testament passages to communicate what he wants to say. The description of the New Jerusalem is a square with 3 gates on each side. This comes from Ezekiel's description in chapters 40 through 48. However, John's description of the city is not the same as Ezekiel's city. In chapters 40 through 48 of Ezekiel, the New Jerusalem is accompanied by a temple, but in John's version, there is no temple. So he's willing to take certain prophecies and then modify them with a new covenant perspective. So these 2 examples show why it is so important, if you want to understand the Book of Revelation, don't use the newspaper, use the Old Testament. That is your answer key for understanding the Book of Revelation. However, there is still one common mistake that prevents people from ever understanding the Book of Revelation. So if you don't want to make that mistake, then click on this video to understand how to truly read the Book of Revelation.